In your maskings, you're probably going to want to denote what is glass and what is not glass. Rhino's material editor is not fantastic, but it's really good at doing something that is pretty simple like this. In a sort of a default file, or in your file, whatever file you're in, over on the Properties tab, there's a Materials tab over here as well. Quick note, if you're using another renderer, this might not be available. So if that's not showing up, just make sure you're using the Rhino render. And what you can do here is you can see all of the materials in the project. You can create a new material, you can import a new material. By default, Rhino has just a few sort of types of materials that are fairly simple. The only ones I would recommend using at this point are plaster and plastic. That's because the gemmed tends to be a little bit too hard to modify. I mean, all of these just have, we just don't need to use the properties of them. So let's create a new plaster material, for instance, here, and we'll call it, let's just call it lobby. So if you click this material, under the material editor here, you can see, you can see you just literally have one option. You have the name, but you have the color as well. So let's change this to a red. And now if I select an object and I change its material, you can see that it will change to that material. Let's create a new plastic material. So I tend to use plastic instead of glass because it sort of simplifies everything that you need for glass, right? You have reflectivity, transparency, and clarity. So reflectivity is how much light it's going to reflect. Transparency is how opaque or transparent it is, and clarity is going to be whether it's if it lets in light, it might be frosted versus polished. So if you have 100% reflectivity, 100% transparency, and it's super polished, it's going to be a very clear glass. You might want to lower the transparency to something like mid 80s, and keep the reflectivity down there as well in the mid 80s. Let's go ahead and change this material. So to change materials, there's a couple options. By the way, in the material editor, if you select an object, it will actually highlight what material that is. So if you need to edit it, you can select the object and then select the material and edit it that way. Let's go ahead and go to the properties of this object after selecting it. This is in my circulation layer, my diagram sublayer. And you'll notice that the material itself is this green plastic, but the display mode has been changed to diagram by layer. I'm going to change it to diagram by material here. So now the transparency and the color are affected by the material rather than just the transparency. This glass has no reflectivity, and honestly in this mode it's not going to change it that much, but in something like a ray traced mode you will see that the reflectivity influences the diagram. Let's go back to the diagram by material here. The transparency is set to about 40 or 50%. So when I go up here, you can see it starts to be changing a little bit more see-through. And then again, the polished versus frosted, it doesn't tend to matter so much in this view mode. But if you're doing renders, or if you're in a ray trace mode, you'll see this becomes very reflective, and actually the reflection and the light that goes through it is now green. Let's change back to the material here. So that's essentially all you have to worry about. I mean, you can change the color of it here as well, give it a slightly blue tint, and keep its transparency down around maybe 60%. And you can see there are sort of jumps here. It doesn't sort of change on the slider necessarily. There can be jumps in transparency, so it's like every 5% or so. But that tends to be a pretty good option. The other way you can change a material's, an object's material is by changing the layer material. So this is my canopy, and right now it's using the layer material. And if I go to my layers, Under my screen layer, I have an abstract version. You can see it's under screen abstract, and it's using this plastic. If I go to my materials here, you can see that it's highlighted, and I can change this to to be less transparent, and then it will start to cast shadows. So to change a layer's materiality, you will see under your layers tab, there is a material option, and you can change that to be one of the materials you've created. And so there I changed it to that red color, or that red material. And here there's all sorts of plastics that I've created with different transparencies. So those are the two options, either selecting the object, going to its properties, and under the material sub sort of header, you can change its material. Or you can go and make sure the material is by layer, and you can change that material's layer, or that layer's material. So change it this way.